Back in the era between 2015 to 2018, there seemed to be a wave of videos criticizing Steven Universe that I thoughtlessly watched and agreed with. I mean, I'd never seen Steven Universe, but, it looked kinda, and the people who liked it were apparently really cringe and annoying, so I sort of just passively enjoyed these videos, making fun of fans of the show. Fast forward a whole lot of years, and I actually watched the show, at behest of one of my close friends. Turns out, Steven Universe is actually pretty good, but also that some of the biggest hate videos on it at the time not only actively lie and manipulate things to a malicious and unjustifiable degree, but also actively spread historical and medical misinformation in the aims of spreading transphobia to their audience. Speaking more specifically, ER's pathetic tirade against the concept of gender, where he hurts himself in confusion. This segment of his video is not framed as a joke, but is actively attempting to discredit the idea of gender itself in order to frame Rebecca Sugar as a pedophile. So for anyone who missed the train, or are just getting in late like I did, here's my brief correction on why ER was wrong about gender.
Gender is defined as the state of being male or female, typically used with reference to social and cultural differences rather than biological ones. In layman's terms, gender is not your biological sex, but what you mentally think is your sex. Now, some of you might be thinking that the brain is biological, and so there literally couldn't be any separation of your mental state from your biology. To put it another way, there'd be no meaningful separation between the terms gender and sex.
Let's break this down as quick and effectively as we can, while also being extremely thorough and hopefully getting across a point that unfortunately has missed a lot of people. He states gender is not your biological sex, but what your brain believes is your sex. Our brains are biological, so how could one's mental state be separate from our biology? And basically every aspect of this is wrong, including the mental state being separate from the biology. Now, this is complicated, but it's not incomprehensible. In fact, it's fairly intuitive. Bear with me, this will be a bit more in-depth than your second grade biology class. The issue with ER's characterization is with the premise itself, namely the way that sex is categorized operates on a number of bimodal spectrums of genetic variation, from our chromosomes to our eye colors to our heights. Have you ever seen a female taller than a male? Of course you have, because while men are generally taller than women, it is by no means rare to see exceptions. The thing is, though, we have thousands and thousands and millions of these variations for each aspect of our biology. Hair growth rates, amount of hair, tendency and placement of stored fat tissue, likelihood of heart disease, and different types of autoimmune complications. These are all things that are somewhat determinative of sex, but more so seen as increased or decreased likelihood depending on your overall placement on the bimodal graphs genetically. On this most basic level, separate from the apparent truth of just going in public and seeing genetic variation, is the fact that there isn't just XX and XY. There are people with XXY, people born with only one X, people born physically with external female genitalia but no womb, people born with a mix of both male and female genitalia, or people born with both ovarian and testicular tissue. Point being, on no level biologically do we cleanly fit into the average bimodal range of the selection of male or female sex. If you are a man, in every way you can think of, but shorter than the average woman, then you are genetically not in full alignment with the center of the male sex as a binary concept. Nobody is. That's why sex is understood to be a bimodal distribution. Millions of genetic variations with loose correlation around the general sex. There is virtually no one person who exists, or perhaps ever existed, in the perfect equilibrium average of every one of their sex characteristics. It's a likelihood smaller than nearly anything. I mean, just think, there's 8 billion people on Earth, and not one person perfectly fits the center of the defining averages of male or female in genetic characteristics. In other words, none of us fit it. So in other words, there's not a rule with a few exceptions, as it's sometimes framed with these chromosomal exceptions. Instead, we are all exceptions that, when pooled and cataloged by the millions, average out into generalized rules when placed on a graph. You know this when you line up kids by height in school, and guys generally tend to be higher and girls tend to be lower, but there's quite a few mixing in the middle. So, knowing this, go to Walmart or like a local park. You can prove the genetic variation yourself. Do you know someone with different eye color than you? Do you know someone with different hair color than you? Hair length? Hair thickness? Knowing this, why would we assume 100% of people, and 100% of those 100% of people's brains genetically happen to land perfectly in the equilibrium of male or female. It's a childlike, ridiculous thing to take seriously for any length of time with a professional. But it's also very complicated to understand, as complex biological structures and science often is. So, how would a brain know that it aligns more with the male or female sex on a genetic and biological level? Well, ask it. If your brain is biological, and your brain is telling you it feels more comfortable in the presentation that fits more so with the stereotypically feminine or masculine, especially to the point that it makes you feel terrible to have been born into the sex or the body that you were, then it is unlikely for the brain to feel that way, enjoy these things, want to do such a thing, if not genetically predisposed to in that way. After all, our personalities are entirely determined by a single area in our brain. Basically, every high school psychology course in the US covers the story of Phineas Gage, who in the 1800s took a beam through the skull and on a dime miraculously lived, but also miraculously changed completely as a person until the day that he died. We exist on a number of spectrums, but when we organize all of these genetic variations, the features create on a graph 2 mounds of general genetic variation. So, I know that was really fast, but that's genetic variation in sex, and how it can fall more or less on one side or the other for literally millions of different genetic components, and in extreme examples, may create things like visually distinct secondary sex characteristics or gender dysphoria in brain science. Not to even mention that people have done brain scans on MTF and FTM trans people and seen that the gray matter aligns more so with the sex that they desire to be mentally. Geez, sorry for this long tirade. But this is basically a pocket edition of debunking every anti-trans argument using actual facts and logic. But now we're on to gender. Gender as a concept are socially constructed guidelines and cultural details that associate with broader sex trends and beliefs of the culture and time. Girls wear pink, boys wear blue. This is not biological, and in different cultures and different time periods, the opposite things have been true, with blue being for girls and pink being for boys. We know girls to wear high heels and guys to wear flat bottoms and sneakers, except high heels were originally invented explicitly for men to specifically wear. Boys play basketball, girls do ballet or gymnastics. Nowadays, there are nearly as many women in women's sports leagues as there are men's. Back in the day, it was seen as mannish and not something that a woman should be interested in. Because these gendered aspects, while in some cases aligning with the average bimodal interests of male and female, was an average, not a rule. And on top of that, because it was socially constructed, this often led women to being seen as a second sex, a second class with less legal rights. Often, the averages making up general interests were used to compound and force people to fit more rigidly into specific boxes. This is borderline eugenicist thinking, because it is forcing genetic reality to fit into artificially constructed boxes rigidly and with little exception, rather than creating boxes that more accurately reflect the biological truth of genetic variation. When people mean gender, this is what they refer to. These socially constructed boxes that are mixed in with scientific half-truths and histories of willful subjugation of women as a lower class. Wanting to broaden these ideas more so outside of the rigid boxes isn't anti-science. It's keeping up with biological reality and a whirlpool of evidence. If you're still uncertain or think, well, surely gender ideas that we have somewhat formed more nebulously from genetics because they were the result of the average people creating them in a culture. This can also be disproven, because not only things like the high heel example that I already mentioned, changing in time and context, but also the existence of hundreds of mutually cohabitating cultures all across the planet that have sometimes similar, sometimes dissimilar, and sometimes completely different or opposing stereotypes associated with the gender in their respective cultures. This contradiction becomes even more apparent in languages with gendered masculine and feminine grammar. For example, the concept of a key in German is masculine, associated often with being heavy, rough, and hard, while in Spanish it's categorized as feminine, associating with small, intricate, and little. Same exact concept, a key, with totally different gender signifiers that actively contradict each other, hard-baked into two coexisting modern cultures and languages. If you watch my Persona 4 series, you may remember the third gender, but not really a gender, but kind of a gender that Japan had in the pre-Meiji eras. If you haven't seen those videos, the Persona 4 analysis series is definitely worth watching. Native American cultures also famously have additional gender signifiers other than man and woman, and different other cultures throughout time, both currently around and not, make such exceptions outside of just two as well. So, I hope that wasn't too much. You can always re-listen if you need to, and while wording it this way makes sense to me, there's probably other people who would explain it better to you. But if you think that you have absorbed the general idea of what I said, let's revisit ER's statements. He states, "Gender is not your biological sex, but what your brain believes is your sex. Our brains are biological, so how could one's mental state be separate from our biology?" Do you see how broken of a premise this is? He nearly gets nothing right about gender or sex, to the level where responding to it is almost impossible. It's similar to trying to answer a question like, "Did you know trees don't exist?" Saying yes or saying no is accepting the premise that trees don't exist, which is false. It's a question that's premises are so fundamentally broken that it literally can't be engaged with as a straightforward answer. He's literally so wrong he didn't even formulate the question right. And, as I mentioned before, since it has been 10 minutes or something, this is based on a quote of Rebecca essentially saying that they want to break down rigid gender roles. So let the girl play with the truck. It's not some heinous, crazy idea. Finally, let's get into his John Money spiel, and just try to keep in mind everything that you just learned here, and see how confidently he asserts his hateful and ignorant mindset, while trying to loosely frame Rebecca as a pedophile.
But John Money thought differently. He thought if, say, a boy were socialized enough to be a girl, that boy could fundamentally be a girl. That is to say, he thought there were no innate differences between males and females. Contrary to the entire field of biology. Now, John Money was unable to get anybody to take his gender pet project seriously, until a boy by the name of David Reimer came along. Upon birth, David lost his willy during the penile mutilation ritual, and so Money found the perfect opportunity to swoop in and perform a bout of human experimentation. He had the infant boy's testicles lopped off, and then had the parents raise David to be a girl while undergoing hormone treatments. Furthermore, he had David, as a young child, imitate sex acts with his twin brother to normalize David as a bottom. Money even had the brothers undress and engage in genital inspections, which he took a photograph of on at least one occasion. Money described the experiments as successful, though David never ended up identifying as a woman and described his visits with Money as traumatic. But whatever, close enough. Except that in adulthood, David's brother killed himself by ODing on antidepressants, and David later shot himself in the head with a sawed-off shotgun.
You're always going to see people that are going to say, well, the Dave Reimer case could have been successful. I'm living proof.
To this day, there isn't a single shred of evidence supporting the existence of gender, in humans, or the rest of the animal kingdom for that matter. So remember, kids, when you use the term gender, you're using the unproven terminology of a mad scientist who happily committed human experimentation, tortured a pair of twin boys, and drove them both to suicide, and got away with it. But I'm sure there's nobody else who would want to experiment on children with such a thing.
John Money is despicable, and you won't find a single professional researching today who believes in what he did or thought it was okay. It is also not the belief that there is no biological differences between the sexes. As I explained already, the biological difference between the sexes is on a large bimodal distribution that has infinite variations. So while John Money was wrong, him being wrong in his experiment actually lends more credibility to current conceptions of transness and all of the information and factual evidence that we have. Using the sort of out-of-date terminology of male brain in a female body for simplicity's sake, what happened to David? He was born male, assumably would have been a regular cis kid, but instead he was raised in a female body and socialization. So even if he never lived life as a male, his biology was still male, and he wasn't trans. He was now a male brain in a female body, and despite not knowing, his still male cis brain gave him body dysphoria about his gender and body. If people really could trans your kids, or you could create more trans people through socialization, then we would have expected John Money to have been right. But he wasn't. He substantiated by total accident that if you put a male brain in a female body and socialize them as women, they will reject the concept and be unlikely to ever accept it. This is what we see with trans people. They feel the same way that David did, in simple terms. Except they didn't get this way from child surgery misplacing them, but a society and political faction attempting to limit the healthcare that would otherwise allow their body's physiology to align with their brains. The fact that he thinks this in any way is even approaching an argument about gender shows an embarrassing lack of even the most basic ideas on the subject, and shows when it comes to media or science or anything about the natural world, his ideology will always supersede factual information, even when his own point is disproving what he's trying to say. In their very innocuous statement of wanting to tear down and play with the semiotics of gender in cartoons for children. The semiotics, again, being the signifiers, the things that we associate with the general ideas of gender. So, boy like truck, girl like doll. Rebecca wants to break down those barriers, and now they're being called a for it. A handful of people have responded to my last two videos, but mainly just people quote retweeting on Twitter of why I'm still hung up on these videos. I first watched Steven Universe less than a year ago, and I didn't watch it primarily because of these videos that I've been covering. I lightheartedly made fun of the show for years, and I believed many of the lies in the videos about the creators. Ignorantly so. Why does it not make sense to debunk videos that quite literally get parroted by openly bigoted brainlets to this day? Literally just search Steven Universe fans, and as recent as a week or less ago, people are still repeating the lies popularized in these videos. It's embarrassing. I mean, if people are allowed to unabashedly lie through their teeth for 8 years without relenting, why can't a single video exist setting the record straight? Why is it cope to have one person come out and go, hey, they're actually saying wrong, incorrect things. You can prove they're wrong. They're just lying. And then those people will be like, oh, you haven't let it go yet? That doesn't make any sense. People will act like it's time to let it go and move on, but they're fronting because they don't want the discourse to evolve. They don't want people to have a loud enough voice that actually dispels the lies that these videos have spread. The biggest of the lies, in my opinion, of course, being the transphobic stuff that I reiterated and debunked here, that is virtually nothing to even do with the show anyways. But if you enjoyed that segment about gender and want to see more of my work, please see the more thorough breakdown of the other two much longer videos, In Defense of Steven Universe and Lily Orchard Was Wrong and Here's Why. In part 2 of the first video, I systematically debunk everything else that ER claims in his original video. It's not too late to change. Growth is something to take pride in. Without growth, you aren't human. If you want to support my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon, super chatting, or sending me a one-time donation on Ko-Fi. This is definitely the most harassment and drama that I've ever been involved in, but I really think that this is important. I'll see you soon.